Good morning or good afternoon. This is the Friday, May 13th Jupyter Lab meeting. Take it away.
So why don't we go around first, just very short, like 10, 15-second status update of what we've been working on in the last week. And maybe I'll start. So Steve and I have been working on a lot on the document management infrastructure in Jupyter Lab. So this is how to have a coherent model for documents and execution tied to the documents and widgets that expose the documents. And we've been iterating a ton, and there's lots of discussion upon the pull requests. We're almost there. I think we're just wrapping up some last little bits, but I think we have a nice design.
Cool.
Steve?
Right, so basically what Jason said, we've got a couple more points of discussion for after this meeting, decision points, but I think we're pretty close to at least getting that merged and iterating from there.
Yep.
And propagating those changes to Jupyter Notebook and Jupyter.js Notebook and Jupyter.js plugins, and finally to the lab.
Darian?
I've been working on the tooltip feature of the console that gets information from the backend contextually based on what you're typing in, the way the Qt console does. And I've had a PR open since last week, but I think as of today, I have it to a point where it's usable enough that I'd like to get that merged, even if we decide to change it. Yeah, there's some questions that we need to resolve still that I can't do. I can't unilaterally decide, so we'll have to talk about it some more. But the bare minimum of the feature does work, so that's cool. It's a good place to start.
Cool.
Chris?
You're muted, Chris. Alejandro, did you want to talk about what you did with Brian last week?
Right, so I should introduce myself for everyone on the call. I'm Alejandro, and I'm with Microsoft, and we were interested in integrating Jupyter Lab more with Spark. That's our scenario. And so we were meeting with Brian to kind of see if we could create a Jupyter Lab plugins that would provide a richer experience with the notebook. And so we were thinking of use cases like, can I talk to a kernel from a plugin and configure the kernel from within the plugin? Or can I, say, have a variable inspector from the plugin? Things like that. And so what Brian and I worked on, we worked on a plugin, a couple of people here on the call helped us, on a plugin that could figure out which was the last notebook that was active. And then from there, that plugin would be able to talk to the kernel by sending messages. So this was a different panel that was able to talk to the last kernel that was active. And so we got that working. I'm not too familiar with the Jupyter Lab code, but apparently I think Steve and Jason, or Steve, I don't remember exactly who coded it up, but kind of coded up a hack for us. And they were saying that, yeah, a hack that works, yeah. And they were saying that they would probably like to go and do something like that, but cleaner. And so yeah, the reason I'm joining, or I'll be joining the calls, is we might want to contribute sometime to work on that too. So yeah, that's me.
I'm really curious, like in just a couple seconds, do you have an example of what you want to do with Spark with a plugin?
So things like, for example, visualizations, automatic visualizations on Spark. Like if you're visualizing a data frame, for example, like if one of your cells has a data frame, can we automatically detect your data set and visualize it for you on a different panel, for example? Or can we provide you a view of your cluster, resources that you have on your cluster, configurations that you might want to do to your cluster, can we provide you a panel that whenever you select the notebook you're working on, shows you exactly the state of your cluster, and you can configure your session and your Spark context on the fly, things like that.
That's really cool. That's really cool. Well, welcome to the crowd.
Yeah, thanks.
Chris?
Okay, so can everybody hear me now?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, great. Yeah, for some reason my headset microphone doesn't play well with the Mac. I'm finishing up the last few bits of the Phosphor UI, the repo squeeze. So finished off menu and menu bar earlier on in the week. Working on command palette and dock panel as the remaining things to be done there. I guess, Jason, you had mentioned earlier about wanting to start using the stuff in Phosphor UI as you work on new things. That's certainly possible, unless you're wanting to use like dock panel and command palette at this point. All the rest of the stuff is ready. I could start punting out npm releases, 0.x releases or whatever, if you wanted to start using that stuff. I would caution though is that that does have there is the potential there to start mixing versions of like Phosphor widget, which could lead to some problems unless we get everything on it. And so, I mean, we could talk about that and see how we can get you on that and see if that's possible or not, or if you just want to hold out. So yes, that's the good.
I mean, the thing is, we're essentially rewriting the notebook code right now to refactor it to play well with this document manager stuff. And while we were refactoring everything and rewriting everything anyway, I thought it was a good time to move to the new signals and stuff like that.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So it was really
you could certainly do that. You could start pulling in. Yeah, so you could pull that in with no conflict.
Okay.
One signals versus the other, that would be fine. So
okay. And when do you think the UI stuff will land?
So core is already out. You can start using that now. There's already 0.x releases of that out. I can push out 0.x releases as soon as you want, or I can hold off until I have the full set ready. It's no skin off my back either way.
Right. As far as landing the plane, like for the UI stuff.
So what I'm trying to do now with commit, now that menu and menu bar is done and I'm working on command palette, I'm trying to see if there's, now that they're all in the same repo, is if we can tie in some of the ideas between commands and the menus and the key maps to make that a bit more seamless in how all of those things talk together. So I'm working on that problem right now, which is a bit vexing. So if anybody wants to bike shed and help save my sanity, I'm welcome to have those meetings. And so it's really getting over that. I think that's the last hurdle. And once we get over that hurdle, we can pull dock panel in. And since we know dock panel's really a cut and paste, except if we want to go ahead and add the maximization feature as an initial thing. If we want to do that in the beginning, spend a bit of time doing that, or I can just kick it out immediately. It doesn't matter either way. Yeah, and then that's it. And then we can update Phosphide to use all that stuff and deprecate all the old stuff.
Okay. I mean, I'm thinking if we initially had a goal of end of May for sort of a minimally usable version, but I'm getting concerned about having that land plus the rewrite of everything to use the new Phosphor core. Does the timeline still work out?
I think so. I mean, the APIs are 95% the same, and so most of the work is going to be updating your import paths.
Okay. Awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. And Pablo can't do video conferencing, but he had some questions about writing widgets. But I guess we'll take those offline with him.
Are those IPython widgets or Phosphor widgets?
Jupyter Lab widgets. Sorry, Jupyter Lab plugins. He wants to do things like configure the text editor and stuff like that. So that might depend a lot on actually the document manager stuff that Steve and I are working on.
Okay.
So
while we do have some guys from Microsoft on the line, I would really appreciate feedback from you guys as you use the plugin API, if there are features that you want, or if you come across any code smells or you think like something could be done better. None of that's written in stone yet. So definitely if you have feedback or comments or concerns about any of that, please let us know.
Right. A note on that, if say I wanted to start writing some plugins to get an idea of where the APIs are, where can I go and look, and like what class is it the one that implements most of the APIs? How can I find the APIs that are available? Things like that.
If you're just talking generic plugin APIs,
But those
I
are in
think,
Fast4JS, I guess, right?
yeah, I would, and Phosphide would be the key name to look for there. If you're talking about stuff that specifically interacts with Jupyter Lab, I mean, right now Steve and I are revamping how documents and kernels and everything works, so everything's sort of up in the air right now. So we invite you to come over and help participate in the discussions and make sure that the use cases that you have in mind are also handled in the stuff that we're doing.
Okay.
But there's not really a set API right now because we're rewriting everything right now.
But like Jason said, if you want to just build a UI component that sits inside the app, you can look at the way plugins are built in the Phosphide repo and use them as your model.
Yeah.
Or in Jupyter.js plugins.
Yeah.
Or in Jupyter.js plugins. Good call.
Yeah, the whole idea behind building, so basically Jupyter Lab is an instance of a Phosphide application, and the whole idea behind that is that everything in a Phosphide application is a plugin. So there's nothing that's, quote unquote special or core or has extra privileges that other things don't. And so like Jupyter Lab, literally the entire application, if you look at the main entry point, is just loading a bunch of separate plugins and services. And so you can either look at the Phosphide repo and its example for how to write those extensions and services and plugins, or you can look in like the Jupyter.js plugins to see how all those are assembled.
But I think maybe we're not really answering your question. Your question was about documentation and what available APIs there are, not necessarily just examples. And the documentation is something that's on the roadmap for us to do, a sort of high-level narrative documentation about these things. There also is, looks like Alejandro left.
So yeah, I had a network problem and then dialed in back in from my phone.
Oh, okay. I'm not sure. What was the last thing you heard?
The last thing I heard was you're welcome to participate on the discussions, but I can go back and watch the recording.
Sure.
You don't have to repeat for me.
Yeah. So essentially, there's a lot of examples. We don't have a lot of narrative documentation. It's on the roadmap for us to do. I think Steve did put together an example plugin and some very initial high-level documentation about writing a Phosphide plugin. That might be helpful, and there's API level documentation in each of the repos for the different projects that gives you sort of low-level reference documentation.
Sorry, Jason.
Okay,
there's an issue open on Phosphide where I had started working on the narrative docs for a plugin, so that's a good place to start. At least points to the right APIs.
Yep, that's what I was thinking of.
Where are these discussions happening? If I want to, as you said, join the discussions of the API.
There's one PR that has most of the discussion right now, and it's in Jupyter.js UI.
Okay.
I'll look for it. It's the issue. There's only 3 issues, and it's the
just called Document Manager.
Common actions for documents. Is that what it's called now? Nope.
The PR.
Oh, it's a PR, right?
Yes.
Document Manager. It's the only PR open in Jupyter.js UI.
Okay.
Is there any other design things that we should bring up?
I had one specific to the Document Manager. We want to talk about those.
Sure.
The first one was what do we consider an independent session on a kernel? Like we can have multiple ways of opening the same path. every time you create an instance of a notebook session, it gets a unique client ID, which is used to filter messages. Should each model have its own client ID? Should each path have its own client ID? Like, what is the purpose of that client ID in terms of logically separating users of this kernel? My gut tells me it's at the very least, by model, you want to have a unique client ID associated with a session with a kernel.
Let me back up just a little bit and give
Sure.
the others some context, because I think it would be really good, especially Darian. These decisions impact you, as in how to hook up kernels to consoles and how that plays with the stuff that we're doing with hooking up kernels to documents. So we have, for every document on disk, we have one or more models in the browser that represent the content of that document, and they may represent the content of that document in multiple ways. So one model might represent a notebook as a JSON data structure with relevant semantic information about the notebook, like it has cells and output areas and things like that. And there might be a separate model in JavaScript that represents the same notebook, the same file path name, but as a text file. So it's opened up in a text editor and just represents it just as plain text. And so if you want to associate a kernel with each of these document models, I think, Steve, your question is,
Well, and you could even argue maybe you want, we have a base assumption that you have one kernel or one session for a given path. Is that even up for grabs? Where you could have the same file open with two different kernels, and they each have an independent session associated with them. Like, what is?
I think this question ties back to also like in the future, whenever we want to implement something like collaboration on the same document, multi-user collaboration on the thing, like online multi-user collaboration, just like Google Docs or anything like that. Wouldn't you have to have a backend that understands each user and is able to merge conflicts for each user? And wouldn't that make you or force you to have the same kernel?
Yeah, personally, I
Yes.
think, yeah. Darian?
I was going to say, just logically speaking, it does seem that way. I'm still waiting to hear a compelling case for collaboration in a code environment. I'm still trying to figure out how that works without frustrating multiple users. But I can't imagine a scenario where they don't have to use the same. They don't have to use the same session. It just seems like you have to.
Okay, so that's one level where all instances of an open document associated with a path should at least share the same kernel, which is an entity on the server,
Right.
or at least on the host computer. That's okay. So we've established that. It sounds like we have agreement on that part. But then it's a question of right now, every time you open a new notebook session, it's those messages are filtered by session. So that's it. Every instance of a notebook session has a unique client ID.
And what we have is a document model on the client side is associated with a session. And so if you had, for example, a notebook opened up as a text file and opened up as a notebook data structure, there's two different models for the same path. And they would have different sessions. A session is just a mapping between file name and kernel. They would have different session data structures.
No,
but those session data structures would point to the same kernel.
Yes, they point to it would have the same session ID. Even it would just have a different.
Right.
Each
Session
kernel would have an instance ID that gets attached to each of the messages that associated with the kernel. So basically, it'd be whether you want to be able to differentiate between all things that are using that kernel or not, and what is that level of granularity of to be able to tell in the message ID who does this belong to? What is that level of granularity? Is it based on do we tie it to the model? Do we tie it to if we're the document manager and we're opening widgets for a given path, do we say, no, all of these have the same, they're completely identical in terms of where messages came from? There would be no way of differentiating.
Yeah. Do we think of each widget as being a separate client of the kernel? Do we think of each model as being a separate client of the kernel? Or do we think of each browser tab being a separate client of the
those
kernel?
are the 3 levels.
Yeah.
If
I
we
think-
thought of every model as a separate agent, would there be a way to reconcile agents?
Yeah, so the kernel would broadcast all output to everybody.
Yeah, IOPub
There's a-
always goes to, as it stands, every instance.
Yeah.
That's using that kernel.
And the input is broadcast to everybody as well. So if any agent, whether the agent is per widget or per model or per browser tab, any agent will get all input that was ever sent to the kernel and corresponding output from the kernel. So there is some syncing that the kernel has.
Anybody else lose Jason?
He is still on the call.
I just lost James too.
This is like one of those horror movies where each getting picked off.
Jason, you back?
Yeah, sorry. Apparently my network didn't like whatever I was saying.
Oh, well, Jamie got kicked off too, so I don't know what happened.
Oh, wow. Well, it says recording's still on, so
Okay.
interesting. Yeah, so to me it feels like the model is the right place, because in the case where we have a notebook open as a text file and open up as a notebook data structure, the text file, though the path has a kernel associated with it, I'm not sure that I want the text file model to know about that kernel. It doesn't make sense to me that it makes sense to me that maybe some models know about the session hooked up to the path, and some models don't know about the session hooked up to the path.
I see. But there still can only be one session according to the server associated with the path.
Right. So there's one session.
Whether you care about it or not.
Yeah, one session, one kernel, but I see the models as different agents interacting with the kernel.
That's fair.
Dumb question for me. Right now, the backend, the kernel doesn't know which path it's using, correct? Which path is connected to.
That's right.
Are we saying, if I'm understanding correctly, are we saying that in the front end,
the kernel does not know. The kernel's a dumb code executor.
Right. It doesn't know anything about files or paths or anything.
Right.
Yeah.
So are we saying that
So
the front end will know which path it's connected to too? Like it will know which kernel and which path?
Right. There's an object on the server side that maintains a mapping between file paths and kernels.
Right. The session manager, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Part of the notebook server, not the kernels.
Right. And so as an agent, when I ask for the kernel associated with the file path, it will hand me back the current kernel or create a new kernel for that path. And so different agents can get the same kernel by asking the notebook server, hey, what's the kernel for this particular path?
I see.
Yeah, anything that asks for a kernel gets a unique client ID which allows you to tell. It's just another unique ID that gets it's part of the headers of all messages sent by the client that allows you to differentiate between instances.
Okay, got it.
But so I think the question impacts Darian in that how do we want to handle consoles? So a console you could think of as a temporary connection to a kernel that has no path associated with it, or you could say at the end of your console session, you might want to save your history, and the natural thing would be to save it as a notebook path. Or you take a console and you open up a notebook path, which essentially opens up the history of that, opens up that notebook as sort of the history in your console, and then just the console is just append only at the bottom. I mean, the real use case for consoles seems to be essentially temporary notebooks that are not saved that just let you interact with the kernel in a way that doesn't clutter up your hard disk.
Yeah, I mean, isn't a console more like a REPL? You don't really save REPLs.
Well, but I could see you saying at the end of your console session, wait, I want to save that history. I mean, that's if you're using sort of a notebook model, that's an easy capability to give to somebody.
Right. It could easily be backed by a notebook file because it's
But you don't know. You guys say that, but your history is indistinct as far as a console session is concerned. My history extends back to every console session I've ever had.
Right. So anything ever hooked up to that kernel.
Yeah. So
you can export the current console's contents as a notebook. Like if you're backing it by a model.
Yeah.
You could export it if you just care about what's in the client and not what's been sent.
Right.
But
so you for the console you could for example maintain internally the same notebook model we're using for the notebook, but not save the disk. And then if there was a file save as or some sort of command to say persist whatever's in my console here to disk, then you could just make the exact same call that we're making to save a notebook model to disk.
Well, I don't have to preemptively do that because there's a collection of cells that won't disappear. I could read them retroactively if necessary.
Oh, fair enough. Okay. But okay, so my question really is, we have the notion of kernels associated with documents. We don't have the notion in this document manager of a notion of kernels not associated with documents. Do we build that into the document manager? Do we just ad hoc say, here's a kernel, you're welcome to share a kernel with something that is actually hooked up to the document manager, but it's sort of outside the purview of the document manager, and this plugin just interacts with the kernel independently? Or like, how do we build that into the design?
We can maybe create the concept of temp files that are not visible so they don't clutter up your sidebar, but do get generated in case we do want to do the save thing.
Yeah, the session manager doesn't care whether the file actually exists or not. It's just a mapping. It doesn't ask.
Right, but we could actually make a file that exists that we're not showing, like a dot file or something, so that way the backend will be storing a thing that is exportable as a notebook, but the console will have access to your real history as well, all 1,000 whatever there are, and we can have a consistent theory of what a session to a kernel is. It's always attached to a file. It's just that sometimes the file is invisible. So that way there's not multiple things.
But this also plays into Alejandro's questions about wanting to have a plugin that interacts with the kernel, and it sounds like not associated at all with the document. I just want to be able to send a kernel commands and things like that. So Alejandro's use case was still have a kernel with not backed by a file.
But if your kernel is talking to a temp file, you don't. That's an implementation detail. You wouldn't care. It's totally transparent.
Yeah.
It just comes with the added benefit of now you have an extra API call to save it as a notebook if you want, without having to store it on the client. Because the console doesn't have a problem. The console can already do that. It does have it in the client. But in general, if everything's backed by a file, the file's not necessarily visible unless you want it to be visible, then you have that capability regardless of what kind of client is hooked up to the kernel.
So then you end up with,
I think in general,
What's that?
I think in general, having everything backed by a file, I think in general is going to be useful in lots of cases. Like especially like, yeah, in cases where somebody spontaneously disconnects or drops network connection or accidentally refreshes or something like that, we'll be able to restore to where they left off if we have that persisted somewhere.
Yeah, that's a good point. So playing devil's advocate,
And it also just simplifies our model of dealing with things. Like nothing special. Everything's a file, and it's 1970 again.
Quick note on a plugin that is not backed by a file and talking to the kernel. Right now, that communication happens over the execute code message, right? And that's the only way we're talking to the kernels today. But what if instead of saying execute code, you had a way to talk to the kernel to have something like a configure message, so that it's completely outside of the code execution model that the kernel might have internally. And so you could say, like, ignore this for purposes of content. This is not a contents message, and this is not a code message that you need to execute on. This is something else completely. Have you thought about that?
no. Maybe that's the answer that you're getting from silence.
Well,
Because I think that
would cause a change to the kernel spec, which affects all existing kernels, which is a delicate process.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, the message spec, there's a much higher bar that must be met to change the message spec versus changing other things.
The thing though is, while I'm hearing the conversation, I'm just thinking, are we trying to make we're talking about having plugins that do not execute code but talk to the kernel. I'm just wondering what they are. The one that I had in mind was a configure and get info, basically. And that doesn't seem to be.
I mean, there's already messages that talk to a kernel without executing code. So like get all the open COM ports and things like that. So there are messages that talk to a kernel to get information that are not executing code that are specific to an agent, right? These are messages that are not broadcast to everybody. They're just sort of a reply request for a specific agent.
Right,
so
and I think I've seen those for information, right?
What?
I think I've seen those for information. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, there's some kernel messages that can be sent to inquire information about the kernel. And so there's precedent to be able to talk to a kernel out of band of executing code.
Okay.
And there's also there's completion stuff as well. That's all the completing stuff that Darian's working on right now. That's that's information queries sent to the kernel out of band of executing code, and the result is not broadcast to everybody. It's sent just back to you to do completions or whatever. So yeah, that stuff is certainly, that class of things is certainly around. So
yeah. Sorry, go on.
So I mean, there is precedence for being able to talk to a kernel but not be backed by a file.
Right, but that's outside the purview of the document manager. The document manager handles paths to kernels.
Right.
That mapping.
Right. So should a console be outside the purview of a document manager, or should it be inside the purview of a document manager and do temporary files? So here's a devil's advocate type of thing. Right now we have it's such a headache with the .ipynb checkpoint files, because they're in every directory you're ever dealing with, and you either have to put them in git ignore, or they just clutter up all your git listing. They clutter up your disk space. So if we don't make it possible to have very temporary models, sort of consoles or something like this, you're constantly dealing with a headache of temporary files that are persisting on your disk. So one thing I've noticed about SageMath Cloud, because it is also it has this model of every terminal, everything is a file, and so you open up a new console like shell terminal, and it's a file, and all your history is stored, which is really nice. When it launches a new terminal, you can open that file, and it essentially opens a new terminal context, but has all of the old commands displayed that you can scroll up to see. I mean, it's really nice. I like it. It's a very consistent model.
Commands and sets up your environment essentially. So
I don't think it. No, it doesn't. Yeah, I mean, it's just
you could just take a snapshot of the environment and then recreate that, including setting the present working directory.
Yeah, this is like the R workspace stuff, right? and other stuff. No, I don't. It doesn't do anything smart like that. At least
Well, you got
not
to be
yet.
careful with that too, because like, what if one of those commands was to remove some files, and now you open a file and it has the effect of.
Yep.
No, I'm not saying execute the files. I'm saying you could display. I mean, not execute commands, but display the history up to a certain amount, and then set the present working directory based on the environment variable that was saved, the PWD variable, and make all the variables.
It's a very limited research.
You could definitely persist env and CWD as part of the terminal file, and then restore that.
Right. So what I've noticed with SageMath Cloud is that I'm not opening up temporary shells all the time. Instead, I'm just opening up some random file that was a temporary shell last time. So I'm reusing terminals session files rather than opening up new terminals. And I think that would happen the same with consoles. If we persisted all consoles to disk, then I would often reuse a terminal instead of opening up a new terminal, because I don't want to clutter up the disk with new files and stuff. Or you could do this transparent, not cluttering up that Darian was suggesting.
I mean, I don't do the same things that you do, but in a normal terminal, like a bash terminal, I don't very often source some shell script and then begin. I usually just begin. And that's sort of what you're describing. You're describing source something and then continue. There's certainly a use case, but it doesn't seem like the de facto, like the default to me.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting that we try to preserve environments and source something and then if we open up an old console, that somehow we persist parts of the environment, but some other parts, right?
I was not talking from a Jupyter console. That was more of a bash session that you're restoring. Right. So it'd be like a mosh thing. Yeah. If to replay a console session, I mean, I guess you could, but that'd be an explicit thing you'd have to ask for.
Yeah, that would be. I think at best we'd probably put it in the history, so you could up arrow and replay whatever you wanted. But okay, still on the table though is how do we deal with console sessions? Are they backed by files? Are they just temporary connections to a kernel that exist while they're connected to the kernel? Wait, Darian's back. All right, so I think this still open question is, how do we deal with consoles? Are they backed by a file? Are they backed by a temporary model that is then saved to a file? Are they backed by a temporary file that's hidden by default in our UI but still clutters up their disk? Are they temporary connections to a kernel that only are handled, only show input, output, etc. while they're connected to that particular kernel?
What about just having an allocated folder that's a temp folder, and by default that's just in the git ignore for everyone, and all temp files go in there, so we don't have to worry about the clutter.
What the PYMB checkpoint is now, and I think GitHub actually might even have that in its default ignore for a Python repository. Pretty sure.
Okay.
Yeah, but IPy console files are not IPy checkpoint files.
Right, yeah, so there'd be a new one, just like Jupyter junk folder.
Yeah, I mean, that seems like a thing that is solvable just by convention at the worst. but possibly by just having a thing in the standard git ignore. But I mean, I don't see a strong reason we have to, in the first pass at what the console offer save at all,
Yeah.
because
Right.
it's not.
Sure.
But we can, if we want to, because it simplifies the document manager. That's fine, because I think my point earlier, and I think Chris also seemed to like the idea, was that we just have one way of connecting, and that way is always file based. It's just a matter of what kind of file it is, whether the file's visible or not. So there's some attractiveness to that idea.
Well,
But
if I think of the document manager as something associated with a file browser, then I mean, I'm not going to open a file and say open this thing with a console, I guess, unless it were a notebook file.
yeah.
That could be possible, where you execute the whole notebook and then create a prompt after that.
Well, or you could have so let's say we go with the console gives you the ability to export and save. And let's call it .pysh or something like that. Just give our right, so .py files. And you open those with the console, you save those from the console, so that the document manager is what you use to open those. Now, when you want to just launch a console without, I guess there needs to be some way of connecting to the kernel and saying, you give me a file handle instead of me giving you a file handle.
Well, we have a create new associated with the file browser, and that could.
Okay, we could do that for the console.
Could be one of the things you create new of.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So you create a blank JPSH file, and that's what you would associate with your console session.
That's the sort of the take that Sage Math Cloud takes. Bash kernels instead of IPython consoles, but there's a .console file, and you create a .console file, and it basically persists your history to disk. And then when you open up a new console, or when you open that file again, it presents you with a fresh shell. But I think it has your old history, so you can scroll back if you wanted to. The other nice thing about having things persist to disk, which essentially means persisting a disk is sort of an implementation detail. What it really means is we're persisting to the server. And another nice thing about persisting to the server, in addition to what Chris was saying about being able to refresh your page and pick up where you left off, is the real-time collaboration and things like that become easy. There's been lots of times in Sage Math Cloud where I've needed to show someone how to do some shell command, or they had some questions about a shell command, and I just hopped into their shell, opened up their shell, and then we had real-time collaboration in the shell, which was really nice.
Okay, but we already have history, so that's not the benefit we want. We want a specific subset of your history, and we want it to re-execute.
Right. Well, I'm not even saying don't re-execute anything. Just
you'd have to if you want to pick up a console session. You wouldn't have the variables that were created otherwise.
Yeah. Well, you don't have the kernel, and you don't have the whole history either. So, I would say don't try to pick it up. Open a fresh new one. Just preload all the previous cells so that they're available in the history. But don't try to re-execute anything. It would be a fresh kernel.
You don't have the outputs then. You just have the. You would only have the inputs then, right? Unless you're storing.
Well, you'd have the inputs and the displayed outputs above you. But
that would give you the impression that you have those variables available.
Yeah.
Right. So that might be too confusing. I agree. Or you could do a UI where you throw a thick line saying, this was old history and this is my fresh new kernel or something. I mean, you could try to do that, but maybe it's too confusing and we don't want to do it anyway.
Well, I suppose you could open it and say, no.
Or maybe you
No.
only save it as a notebook, and you can only open it as, I mean, that's the way we persist kernel execution is as a notebook, and you save as a notebook, and next time you open it, it's a notebook.
Well, but Chris was talking about a specific set of our users who want to work in a console environment and just don't care about notebooks at all.
Yeah,
Are
that's
those
true.
types of users going to want to export? Like, are we basically who's this feature for? If this feature is for people who already use notebooks, they'll probably just use notebooks. If this feature is for a different set of users, maybe they don't want to save as notebooks. I don't know, but we should probably find
used as
Maybe-
a sidecar for a notebook. Like if I want to just connect to the same kernel as my notebook, basically Min's little he has like a scratch cell add-on
Yep.
right now.
Yeah.
A console could take the place of that.
Yeah, or what I'm thinking of is the very common workflow of, and maybe this addresses the persistence issue in the common use case now, and that is I have a file and I have a console and I highlight some code in my file and press a button or something or other, and it gets copied into the console, and my persistence is my Python file that I'm dealing with. And I mean,
okay, so now
then I wouldn't want to persist a console. I want the console to be a temporary place that I can execute my Python file.
So Steve was building the ability to drag and drop cells. Can you just drag a cell from your console into your notebook?
Yeah, that too. Or you could drag a cell into your notebook, or again, the big workflow that we're really missing now that a lot of people are used to is having a text file. So this is the MATLAB workflow, the RStudio workflow. You have a text file that has your code in it. That's your persistence of your code. And you have a console. And you have an easy way to essentially copy code, blocks of code from your text file to your console. And the console is seen as a ephemeral, temporary execution engine for
Wait,
the
I don't
code that's stored in your file.
Why can't you just paste that in to your prompt?
You could, but Control C, click, Control V, go back here, click, Control C, go back over here, click, Control
But it's a
V.
Python file. Why do you have to do that multiple times? Why can you not just paste the whole file into one prompt?
Because you're executing parts of the file. That workflow is supported by MATLAB, RStudio, and Spider at this point.
Yeah, Spider too. That's right. And the idea is you have sort of your notebook is just snippets of code in a Python file, and there's and you could separate the snippets with.
Okay, it's not one continuous thing you want to run in one go.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Yep. So you're somewhat interactively working with it, but you don't want the overhead of a notebook, and you want to be able to easily just essentially rearrange the code that you're executing here, or you might want to execute this snippet 10 times, and so you press a button or whatever 10 times, and each time it's copied into the console and executed. So I mean, in that use case, the console really is a very temporary execution engine for a notebook, and I don't see a use case for that being backed by a file other than Chris's ever-present use case of your network goes down, I want to refresh. And so I refresh, and now I have my console because the kernel connection maybe is redone because it knew that the kernel was still there and the kernel's still live. So I reconnect my console to the same kernel, but somewhere I lost all the history of the kernel because I didn't persist that anywhere.
Yeah,
and that's a real issue actually. So being able to deal with that use case is
yeah, I guess you could say if this kernel is still alive, I can rebuild my console and hope that the variables are still there and be optimistic. That's the best you could do because there's no
but you would be missing
a snapshot to just ask the kernel, what's your current execution count?
Well,
no,
R can.
If you reconnect to the same kernel and you can reconnect with the same session, those variables are already there. And if
Unless
you just
been overwritten by subsequent execution.
Yeah, you might have missed some executions.
Well,
can you ask a kernel for? Can you ask a kernel for a full history of executions?
I asked the kernel for the last 500 things in its history, and I don't think a thing gets added except if it successfully executes. So my mistakes don't show up.
But it's just inputs, or is it inputs and outputs?
When I ask for history, it only gives me inputs. I don't know if it stores outputs, but I think it doesn't.
And it's up to the kernel to decide when to store its history.
Yeah. Right.
The
They
kernels I've
execute
written right
requests.
now, they store their history when you shut down. They don't keep writing to disk.
Right. And in an execute request, I can tell it not to store it in history as well. So I can do things out of the history too.
Yep.
Yeah, but
when you open
no
up a
way.
console and connect to a new kernel, do you actually fill back in the history? Like,
I just ask for give me the most recent 500 history items, and that gets stored on your client session, so you have them.
Do you display it, or do you just use it for completion and stuff, or up arrow stuff?
I just use it for up and down arrow.
Okay.
Yeah. And it gives me 500, but it counts contiguous repetitions. I don't, so I filter down.
Right. Yeah, for up arrow, that makes sense. To me, it sounds like there's a use case for having plugins be able to talk to a kernel that's not backed by a file. Like for a plugin to be able to just get a handle on a kernel and send code to it. Maybe not the console, but the other use cases that Alejandro was talking about, where I just want to be tied to a kernel. I want to be able to get a kernel and talk to it.
But that is not a document manager because it's not tied to a path.
Right, though I might want to get the kernel tied to a path, right? I might want to.
Well, that's part of the generic change kernel or get kernel dialog. It knows what kernels are available and what paths are associated with them from the REST API.
Right. So it sounds like as an initial. Darian gone again. Wow, this network is.
No, I'm still here.
Oh, okay. It sounds like to me an initial take on the console might be to just treat it as an ephemeral thing and not worry about it as a document, because there's decisions still about making it a document aware thing. And so initially just treat it as an ephemeral thing that can be hooked up to the same kernel as a notebook, or that you can copy stuff into from a text file.
The thing we store on disk could be just the fact that we have this console open and here's the kernel for it, so that if you had to recreate, then you just open up the console fresh with that kernel. And so you wouldn't have this history shown, but at least you have that same session open.
I still think we should store the inputs, like the code that was executed. You don't need to store the outputs. But so you can open up, like if you refresh, you still have the history of everything you typed into the console.
You would get that from the history request that you sent, that Darren's sending when he starts up.
Yeah, the kernel itself is storing the history.
We have that is if we're storing it.
Yeah, so what I get from the history request isn't necessarily what you did, because it might not be from your last session, it might be from your last 20 sessions. Plus, if you executed the same line 10 times in a row and it's an increment, for example, that means the variable is different because I'm already compressing those. And yeah, so I mean, I can imagine an interface where you open a console and it says, looks like your session was interrupted, gives you a bunch of stuff and says, do you want to execute this stuff or dismiss it? I can imagine a console that does something like that, but that's a very different kind of application than the consoles I'm used to. But then again, the consoles I'm used to are terminals. They're not for analysis. So maybe maybe literally you hit, Command R, the page refreshes. What the console does for you is give you a modal and you have to make a decision. Do you want me to re-execute this stuff that you had going before, or do you want to start from scratch?
I don't see how re-executing that would ever be the right thing to do. Yeah, because the kernel executed the stuff that still exists, hasn't gone away, and so its state is still there. So I don't think we'll ever gonna want to automatically re-execute lines of code for the user.
So we're saying that JP's sh file, whatever you want to call it, consists of the history it starts out with the history that you grabbed, and then we update that with the actual history as we're changing on the client, which we're then having to persist regularly so that if a refresh happened, we can pick up where we left off with that history.
Yeah.
So that means you store the inputs and the outputs so that you could display them as static and not have to worry about having the
just to have the up work.
Oh.
Hey guys, I gotta run. I'm really
Yeah.
interested in this conversation though, and I think we do need to make a decision just to move forward with an initial implementation of the console, in the next couple of weeks.
I think let's leave the console not file based for now, because that's what the Qt console's like.
Okay.
And then take it from. I mean,
Yeah.
You know what? Like, no, I don't want to just off the cuff say that. That's my inclination, but I don't feel that strongly.
That decision doesn't affect what we're doing with the document manager right now.
Right.
So
right. And we always have a path forward to back it by a file.
Yeah.
So this means for now, refreshing the tab will essentially kill the console. I mean, there's a question also of how do we hook the console back up to the kernel, or does it just kill the console? I don't have time to discuss it right now. I'm actually already late for my next meeting. But anyway, I'm glad we brought it up and started talking about it.
So maybe we can work that out next week. Will next Friday be too late for folks?
Sounds like we need a meeting on Monday.
Yeah.
Okay.
At least Jason and I do.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
We can take this offline, and then at the next meeting we can tell you what we decided, and we'll try to also post stuff up to issues and stuff like that. So I mean, it's not just the decision between the four of us. It's something that the community has input into.
Great.
Okay.
Sounds good.
Cool.
Thanks, Jamie.
Yep. Thanks,
Thanks
guys.
so much.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you, Alejandro. See you.
No, thank you.
Everyone.